Hello my friends, I have a fabulous video tonight. This is just mind-blowing. When the information that I'm about to share with you tonight, when that penny dropped for me, I didn't sleep that night. I had broken and disturbed sleep. The reason for this wasn't any kind of stress. What it was the enormous reorganizing of my worldview that was demanded by this discovery. Tonight's video is about the Black Death from the 14th century. You might wonder what the Black Death has to do with what's happening in the world today, and I'll make that case as this video progresses. But in order to make the case and tell this, it's a ripping yarn. It truly is an exciting story. We have to start with Louis Pasteur. Louis Pasteur, some may be aware and some may not. He's the dude from the mid 19th century who came up with what's known as the germ theory. The germ theory pretty much states that the bacteria are all going to make it, well, not all of them, but the bacterial world, the microbiological world, is how we get sick. And his germ theory has dominated the world of medicine ever since. Many won't know that he had a scientific nemesis, a true genius, whose name was Antoine Bechamp. Many will also not know that Louis Pasteur was a fraud and a plagiarist, and this is very well documented. I've read two books on the history of Louis Pasteur and Antoine Bechamp, and I will note the two books that I've read in the reference below this video on my YouTube channel. But most importantly, it's just a brushstroke because I want to get to the crux of this conversation, which is the Black Death of the mid-14th century. So the problem with Antoine Bechamp is he didn't seek attention. He was a true scientist, and his theory was diametrically opposed to Pasteur's, though Pasteur did steal a lot of his research. Antoine Bechamp's theory was called the cell theory, or alternately the terrain theory. And the premise for that theory is that all disease, absolutely without exception, all disease originates from within, and that the bacterial world, which he defined as pleomorphic, that meaning that all the bacterial forms are created within the body and change their form depending on the problem that the organism is throwing up that needs to be resolved. He pretty much died an unknown, Antoine Bechamp, though he was a true genius because he wasn't wedded to fame and fortune. He was wedded to the science. So let's go. This is a really ripping yarn. One of the things we don't realize is how two events from history, one nearly 700 years ago, the Black Death, and another one only 100 years ago, the 1918 Spanish flu, have defined the way our entire society relates, believes about the idea of contagion and contagious disease. And I'm going to go through the events of the Black Death of the mid-14th century in this video. The World Health Organization official narrative about the Black Death is that a microorganism by the name of Yersinia pestis arrived, and it arrived in fleas. And the fleas infected this microorganism. I hope you're asking questions already, like how could they possibly have known 600 years after the fact that some little pathogen caused a disease that wiped out a quarter to a third of humanity? Nevertheless, this is what their narrative is. This Yersinia pestis was carried by fleas, and the fleas infected, this pathogen to millions upon millions of rats. And the rats succumbed to this infection, this supposed, theoretic, alleged contagion, and they died en masse. They died in their millions. And then the fleas had to turn on someone else in order to unload their deadly pathogenic load, and that was humans. So the Black Death suddenly caused enormous pestilence and death throughout not just Europe, but across into China as well. So this is what we're going to do. We're going to look at real research that's been done about the Black Death, rather than some little story that's been made up by modern pharmaceutical companies and the World Health Organization in order to perpetuate a belief in infection and contagion. We're going to start with a dendrochronologist. Now, most people won't know what a dendrochronologist is. A dendrochronologist is a person that studies tree rings. So this dendrochronologist, Professor Mike Baillie, and there'll be a reference to him below this video for anyone that wants to research further into this. Professor Mike Baillie, B-A-I-L-L-I-E, he studied the tree rings from the 14th century, and he noticed universal change in growth patterns in trees across vast areas of the world. He undertook further investigations, and he discovered in ice core data during the period of the mid-14th century that there were increased ammonium and other toxic atmospheric pollutants in ice core data from that period. He also studied, let's get real, doesn't matter what's happening in history, there's always someone writing about it. And so he read contemporary accounts of what was, eyewitness accounts. There's always an eyewitness. And the scribes described very, very clearly what they saw. Remembering that in the 14th century, no one had the first clue about what contagion was. The whole idea of contagion started at the time of Louis Pasteur. 600 bloody years later, all they knew is that shitloads of people were dying. And it seems that they were dying in some sort of asphyxia. That's why they went black. You strangle someone to death, they go black, right? So contemporary documents state the following. There have been masses of dead fish, animals, and other things along the seashore, and in many places trees covered in dust. Doesn't sound like a rat plague, does it? Trees covered in dust. All of these things seem to have come from the great corruption of the air and earth. These are quotes, by the way. Great corruption of the air and the earth. I don't know about you guys, but what is unfolding here in this profoundly quality research, it should change your view of the world within which you live. So the air was corrupted. It was toxic. It was poison. The trees are covered in dust, and there is some sort of an event that is reflected in the tree rings across the world and in ice core data in Antarctica. So about these dead fish, by the way, I'm just wondering how all of these fish succumbed to a pathogen that was carried by fleas. Is our little voice starting to ask questions now? This is just so fucking awesome to me. Blows my mind. So if contemporary writers were so observant that they documented the dust on trees and the dead fish, one would expect them to have documented the millions upon millions upon millions of dead rats, right? Well, there were no such accounts in contemporary narratives. They wrote of no mass death of rats. But they did write about a great corruption of the air and the earth. Baillie says of the tree rings, the Black Death sits in a clear environmental trough, visible in smoothed tree ring chronologies from around the world. A major corruption of the air occurred to make this environmental trough, sufficiently severe to have caused death from respiratory problems, affecting respiration in some catastrophic way. All contemporary writers said that the disease was pulmonary. That's breathing, respiratory. Clearly some event caused this sudden corruption of the air over a large portion of the world. People literally asphyxiated to death. This is the Black Death. This is the contagion that you guys all learned about in school. So let's follow this new thread. A major earthquake happened in Europe on the 25th of January 1348. But it was, according to Professor Baillie, not a singular event. Part of a series of earthquakes that happened during the mid-14th century, both before and after the January quake of, just remembering this, the 25th of January 1348, pretty much mid-14th century. An unusually high amount of ammonium has been found in ice core data from this period, all the way down in Antarctica, and I would assume into the Arctic as well, a long way away. Also, interestingly, other plagues from previous times have been associated with high ammonium in ice cores. So this is Baillie's conclusion. There really is enough information about comets, earthquakes, and ammonium to permit the quite serious suggestion that the Black Death was due to an impact by comet debris on the 25th of January 1348, as witnessed by the major earthquakes on that day, unquote. Investigations and analysis of the toxic chemicals found within comets and comet debris have produced further supportive evidence for this conclusion. Professor Baillie continues. Apart from ammonium, it is now known that a range of unpleasant, toxic and evil-smelling chemicals, including hydrogen sulfide and carbon disulfide, have been detected in recent comets. The presence of evil-smelling chemicals would certainly explain the documented reports about the corruption of the atmosphere. Their toxicity also explains how these chemicals would have caused severe respiration problems and rapid death from asphyxiation for those people in close proximity to the dense atmospheric poisoning. Herbert Shelton provides further documentary evidence of 14th century earthquakes and the subsequent pollution of the atmosphere in his 1967 article entitled Pestilence and Plagues, that states, Hecker's Epidemics of the Middle Ages says of the plague that mighty revolutions in the organism of the earth, of which we have credible information, had preceded it. From China to the Atlantic, the foundations of the earth were shaken. Throughout Asia and Europe, the atmosphere was in commotion and engendered by its baneful influence both vegetable and animal life. Endangered. In the same article, Herbert Shelton also quotes, in 1337, 4 millions of people perished by famine in China. In the neighborhood of Kiang alone, floods, famine and earthquakes were frequent, both in Asia and Europe. In Cyprus, a pestiferous wind spread a poisonous odour before an earthquake shook the island to its foundations, and many of the inhabitants fell down suddenly and expired in dreadful agonies after inhaling the noxious gases. German chemists state that a thick, stinking mist advanced from the east and spread over Italy in thousands of places, and vast chasms opened in the earth, which exhaled the most noxious vapours. Not sounding much like a contagion to me. Pretty horrific event, and relatively recently, so I'd like to think that it won't happen in my lifetime or the lifetime of my children. These conditions that have been described can be explained by comets and massive widespread earthquakes, seismic activity. They cannot be explained by rat fleas infected with disease-causing bacteria that were invented 600 years. It's kind of comic, really, when you think about it. And yet everyone is so wedded to this idea of science. Science is fabulous. I love science. But so much of it in our modern world is corrupted by the agendas of those who fund it. Another outbreak of plague occurred in England during the 17th century. Although it is reported to have been minor by comparison to the Black Death, some fascinating details have been found from contemporary writings, including those of notable authors Daniel Defoe and Samuel Pepys, both of whom lived during the period in which they occurred. The following extract from the diary of Samuel Pepys, dated 24th of December 1664, states that he, quote, saw the comet, which is now, whether worn away or no, I know not, but appears not with a tail, but only is larger and duller than any other star, unquote. The episode of plague that affected England and especially London occurred in June 1665, and therefore only a few months after the sighting of the comet. This is also described by Daniel Defoe, who, in his novel entitled Journal of the Plague Year, wrote that, in the first place, a blazing star, or comet, appeared for several months before the plague. These are contemporary accounts, just reminding you guys. This is people that witnessed it, telling us what they saw. The evidence from contemporary records, as well as tree ring and ice core data, demonstrates the existence of a corrupted atmosphere during the 14th century and also during the 17th century, but to a lesser degree. The earthquakes and impact of comet debris provide credible explanations for that corrupted atmosphere and for its ability to have permeated a significant portion of the planet. The toxic substances known to be associated with comets and comet debris provide an extremely compelling explanation for the rapid onset of severe respiratory problems, asphyxiation, and death. And I imagine what you would look like if you were asphyxiated. I think you'd look a bit black. It's easy to make light of it now, 700 years later, but it must have been horrific. So we can see the story of a contagious pestilence was entirely manufactured by post-Louis Pasteur people with an agenda in an attempt to terrify humanity into a belief in contagion, which you may be shocked to know has never been proven in a single scientific study to exist, nor to satisfy the foundational premise of contagion theory, those being Koch's postulates. This can be researched further. So I've established conclusively that the Black Death was not a contagion. It just simply was not. The next step is to ask why an event from our past, where the mainstream narrative is entirely verifiably false, should not have its historical context reissued in light of such credible research. Why wouldn't it be? It's not a conspiracy theory. This is fact-finding, my friends. And the demonstrable facts don't align with the agenda of the World Health Organization. Why is that? It's in the WHO, Bill Gates, Merck Pharmaceuticals, etc., etc., etc. It's in their interest for us to all have our worldview anchored into the story of contagion. and to live in terror of the next plague. That, by the way, is not coming unless it's delivered via a syringe. Fuck me, those poor rats. You know, the collective energy of rats must just be going, what the fuck have we done to deserve the treatment that humans have dished out to us? The truth about rats is they proliferate where we leave shit around for them, that being cities. We have rat plagues in cities, in our most squalid places. That's where we have them. Everywhere else, they're just little furry creatures that were never going to do harm to anyone. So next time you see a rat or a mouse or even a cockroach, just get over it. They're not going to make you sick. You don't have to worry. So there you have it, my friends. A complete rebuttal of the single largest event in history that the Contagion Brigade, post-Louis Pasteur, have appropriated in order to perpetuate an ongoing fear that you're going to catch something from somebody. Thank you for listening, and I will have references below this video if you want to look further into the information that I've presented. Thank you.